Pat and Hal, and good evening to everyone. Every year at this event, we present awards to individuals and organizations who have distinguished themselves by extraordinary contributions to the fight against HIV/AIDS and the fight for LGBT health. The awards are named for Joel Toubin, who died of HIV-related causes, and he was the brother of former Whitman-Walker board member Cheryl Weiner and brother-in-law to former DC Bar President Bob Reiner. I am pleased to present our first award this evening to a legal scholar, teacher, activist, and public official who has shaped disability law and sexual orientation and gender identity law for over 25 years. As legislative counsel to the ACLU in the late 1980s, Chai Feldblum was a principal force behind the enactment of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Subsequently, as a Georgetown law professor, she was a leading scholar and activist, making major contributions to the rights of people living with HIV/AIDS and other disabilities, as well as the rights of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered individuals and families. In response to federal court decisions cutting back on the protections in the ADA for people with HIV and other disabilities, Professor Feldblum, while at Georgetown Law School, was a key player in the enactment of the ADA Amendments Act, which strengthened this critical law's coverage and put to rest any doubt that the ADA protects all people living with HIV at every stage of infection. In light of her distinguished career, President Obama nominated Chai Feldblum to the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in 2009. She was confirmed in 2010. As an EEOC commissioner, she took a leading role in the issuance of the commission's regulations under the ADA Amendments Act, perhaps most notably for our work at Whitman-Walker. During Commissioner Feldblum's tenure, the EEOC has included workplace protections for LGBT employees in a strategic enforcement plan and issued a groundbreaking decision in the case of Macy v. Holder, holding that transgender employment discrimination is discrimination based on sex within the meaning of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. I am also delighted to note that late last week, President Obama nominated Commissioner Feldblum for a second 5-year term on the commission. Perhaps that was in anticipation of tonight's event. But in any event, it was wonderful news. Chai Feldblum's work as an advocate, scholar, teacher, and EEOC commissioner has greatly improved the lives of many, if not most, Whitman-Walker clients. The ADA and the ADA Amendments Act has transformed the workplace for people living with HIV/AIDS, as well as many other disabilities. Her efforts have also given new hope to LGBT people who previously had been forced to accept discrimination as a fact of life. It is therefore with great pleasure that we present the 2013 Joel A. Toubin Award to Chai Feldblum.
I love this little podium, except that if I was standing on a box, which I really should be, you would all see it. So, all right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to Whitman-Walker, number one, for everything you do. So for those of you who are on the board, those of you who are on the staff, I just think it's fantastic, the work that you put in. So that's my thank you back to you before anything else. Yes. What I actually want to do is just give you a little bit more of the human story behind what you just heard from Adam in terms of the work that's been done. Not all of the story, number one, so that we can have the next honorees, but also because not everything should be told, but some of it should be. So I was thinking about tonight and thinking about how this must happen every year at Whitman-Walker event, that there's a room of people who are working and thriving and living and loving, and there's also a whole bunch of other people who are not here. And I think especially for those of us who lived through the 80s and 90s and doing this work, that's particularly poignant. And so I'm actually going to dedicate this little snapshot story of some of the work to Tom Stoddard, who was a really wonderful person who did incredible work in this area. Yeah. And it actually fits into I was thinking how to explain how one really can make a difference, right? Every single one of us. And I thought, actually, if I was going to narrow it down to just 3 things. Number 1, finding people to learn from, right? None of us are coming onto a blank slate here, right? It's always people who have come before. So finding someone to learn from, someone to mentor you, someone to have faith in you, number 1. Number 2, stepping up to the plate. It's not enough to have someone else have faith in you. You have to decide to take risks. You have to assume that you can do something, even if it sort of looks impossible. And I remember early on getting this thing that said, show me a person who's never made a mistake, and I'll show you a person who's never made anything. And that's the thing. It's about stepping up to the plate. And the third is sort of being at the right place at the right time. But of course, you never really know that till later. So my recommendation is always assume you are at the right place at the right time. Okay? And act. So for me, it started in 1987. I was working for Justice Blackmun on the Supreme Court. A case came up called School Board of Nassau County versus Arline about a woman with tuberculosis who had been fired. And she sued under the then anti-discrimination law that protected people with handicaps. And the argument of the then Reagan administration was, well, yeah, contagious diseases might be covered, which is what the lower courts had said they weren't covered. But if you just discriminate against someone because of fear of contagion, as opposed to the impairment itself, the disease itself, it's just the fear of contagion, that's not covered under the law. Okay, so for all you lawyers in the room, right, you can get it, right? I mean, this is a very strict looking at the words. You can't be discriminated against because of the disability, because of the medical condition. This is only fears. And the Supreme Court rejected that in a 7-2 opinion and basically said, no, people are covered, whether they have contagious diseases or not, and you can't separate fear of contagion from the contagion itself. The day the opinion came down, the next day the newspapers were all about people with AIDS and HIV covered, which of course was the main issue at the time. Although I think a lot of the justices didn't quite get that. They were like, really, AIDS? I knew it was dealing with AIDS. Because, my friends were dying of AIDS at that point. So that was just protection for people who worked in schools that got federal funds or hospitals that got federal funds. The big issue was getting protection for people with AIDS and HIV across the board, in private employment, housing, etc. And at the time, there was a bill that Tim Westmoreland, who was one of the people I consider my mentors and people I learned from, was working on, an AIDS testing confidentiality non-discrimination bill. And I had started work at the AIDS Action Council after I clerked for Justice Blackmun, and then had moved to the AIDS project of the ACLU. And I was at the ACLU, and a woman named Jean McGuire, who is now sitting in the 3rd row here, she just happened to be in town, yes, comes to see me with another woman, Pat Wright, and says, you know what, we don't really think there should be a law that just protects people with AIDS and HIV from discrimination. It should be a more general law that protects all people with disabilities, people who have diabetes and epilepsy and wheelchairs, and people with AIDS and HIV. And mind you, I was working for the AIDS project of the ACLU. And I was like, really? But it was both a matter of ethics, right? That why should one group get what's now the stigmatized group might not be the one 20 years from now. So it was a matter of ethics, but also a matter of strategy. Like, it's about community and going at this together. So, okay, well, I'll talk to my boss. So, I actually had 2 bosses whom I also count as 2 amazing mentors. Nan Hunter had started the Lesbian Gay Rights Project and the AIDS Project at the ACLU. She was in New York, and Mort Halpern in the DC office. So I go up to talk to Nan. Now, mind you, Nan was not only my boss, she is also the love of my life. And she's also sitting in the 3rd row here. But, of course, at the time, I did not tell her she was the love of my life. She was my boss. She's the love of my life. See, you just wait long enough and things just come around. But anyway, I did disability-wide bill, and she said, how long do you think that'll take? I said, I don't know. And I don't know that we're going to get it on our own. And you know what? It was the right decision. That became the Americans with Disabilities Act. When there were efforts made to strip people with AIDS and HIV from the bill, the disability community-wide came together to protect it. So that's where we got it. In 1990 was both two bills that I had worked on, the ADA and the Whitman-Walker Care Act, both enacted in 1990. Nothing stays static, right? Things move in both very good ways. I mean, in the 80s, the stigma, the fear, the heartache, the loss, I mean, it was almost overwhelming. And over time, that has changed. But the other thing that sometimes happens is laws are not static. So I often say, I don't have kids, biological adopted kids, I have laws. Okay, so instead of it's a boy, it's a girl, it's a law. And they're really easier than kids sometimes. But here's the thing. Kids go off to school and they meet these friends and suddenly they have purple hair and those friends, you're like, who are you? Right? And laws go off to court and meet judges. And suddenly, what you thought was in that law is not what's in that law. So I used to say by the time the ADA would have been having its bar mitzvah in New York City, totally needed a sibling. But again, laws are a little harder to make than kids. Sometimes, and so it took a while, but we did finally get the sibling, the ADA Amendments Act, that did in fact make very clear that people with AIDS and HIV as well as other disabilities were covered. But then, and this is the last piece of it, I thought, you know, part of what made the courts go off in the wrong direction on the ADA were the regulations that the EOC had put out on the ADA in 1991, and it just sort of set it off in the wrong direction. So my name had been in at the White House to be considered actually for the DC circuit, because from both the gay community and disability community, not because I thought I would get it, but I thought, sure, you can put my name in. And then I got a call from the White House sort of out of the blue saying, do you want to be an EOC commissioner? I was like, hello. I hadn't really thought about that. Then I thought, you know, this is almost like going with the kid to kindergarten. You know, like let's just get, and this was a bipartisan bill that had passed, the bipartisan law that had passed. So it's very important in terms of having a bipartisan regulations, which is what we ended up getting in the ADA. So I guess to conclude, what I would say is two things. One, I think it's really important to focus on the commonality among us, to think about coalitions, to think in that way. I think it's important to stay focused on the actual people that laws and regulations affect, and also to just be able to take the hits when they come, because they will come, and to keep our eyes on the prize. And the prize has to be a life of integrity and equality and freedom for anyone living with chronic illness, anyone living with any disability, certainly for all of us as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. This is the basic, to live a life of integrity and freedom. So thank you, Whitman-Walker, for doing everything you do and having the legal services program. And thank you, all of you in this audience, for all the work you do. Thank you.